the fall before the rebirth. There are moments in history when the world seems to lose its balance, when the empires that once stood like mountains begin to crumble into dust, and the people who built them are left, wandering through the ruins searching for meaning among the stones. 14th century China was one of those moments. For nearly a century, the Mongol Yuan dynasty had ruled over the vast lands of the Middle Kingdom, stretching from the frozen steppes of the north to the rice fields of the south. Their conquest had been brutal but absolute. Yet as time passed, their strength became their burden. The empire that had once connected the east and the west under the might of Kublai Khan now groaned beneath its own weight. Corruption seeped into the court like rot and old timber. Famine stalked the countryside, and the mandate of heaven, the divine right that justified an emperor's rule, seemed to slip from their grasp. It was as if heaven itself had turned away. The Mongols had once been seen as invincible. They had built their capital at Dadu, what we now call Beijing, and had filled it with all the wonders of an empire that spanned continents. But under the later Yuan emperors, the glory began to fade. The vast bureaucracy, meant to manage the empire's wealth, had grown corrupt and inefficient. Taxes rose while harvests failed. The Yellow River, the lifeblood of the north, flooded unpredictably, washing away farms and villages alike. Peasants starved as officials feasted. Disease swept through the cities. And in the quiet desperation of the countryside, whispers began to spread. The Mongols had lost the mandate of heaven. The gods had chosen to abandon them. Among those who suffered in these years of decay was a boy named Zhu Yuanzhang. Born in 1328 in a small village in Anhui province, he came from a family of tenant farmers people who tilled land they did not own, and whose lives depended on the whims of landlords and the moods of nature. When drought struck their region, famine followed swiftly. His family, like countless others, was forced to wander in search of food. One by one, his parents and siblings succumbed to starvation and disease until Zhu was left alone. He sought refuge in a Buddhist monastery, where the monks offered him food and shelter in exchange for labor. But even the temples could not escape the chaos of the age. Bandits raided the countryside, and imperial soldiers, desperate and unpaid, looted as they pleased. In time, Zhu left the monastery and joined a growing rebellion, the Red Turbans, who rose against the Yuan in the name of restoring China to its people. The Red Turbans were a strange coalition of outcasts, monks, farmers, and warriors bound together by hunger and hope. They claimed to fight for a vision of justice, inspired by a mix of Buddhist prophecy and ancient Chinese ideals. But like all rebellions, they were as divided as they were passionate. Zhu began as a foot soldier, carrying a spear and little else. Yet he watched carefully, learning not just how to fight, but how to lead. His intelligence and calm decisiveness set him apart. In a world ruled by chaos, he understood that order, not brute force, would win the future. Over time, Zhu rose through the ranks, commanding respect through discipline rather than fear. When he finally took leadership of his own forces, he ruled them like a family rather than an army. His message was simple: we do not fight to destroy. We fight to restore. The years of rebellion that followed were long and merciless. Cities were besieged, alliances were broken, and entire provinces were left in ruins. But Zhu's vision was different. He was not merely fighting the Mongols. He was fighting the moral decay that had allowed the empire to fall. He sought not just victory, but renewal. As the Yuan's power weakened, Zhu consolidated control in the south. From his base in Nanjing, he began to lay the foundations of what he called a new and righteous order, a return to the principles of harmony between heaven, earth, and humankind. The idea of the mandate of heaven was not simply a divine gift, it was a responsibility. To rule justly was to maintain balance in the cosmos itself. In Zhu's mind, this balance could only be restored through discipline, morality, and devotion to the people. By 1368, after decades of bloodshed, Zhu Yuanzhang marched north. His armies swept through the plains like a cleansing wind. The Mongol capital of Dadu fell without much resistance. The last Yuan emperor fled into the steppe, leaving behind a city of empty palaces and broken statues. The Mongol Empire in China was finished. On that day, Zhu proclaimed himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Ming, the Brilliant. It was a name chosen not for conquest or pride, but for renewal. The darkness had passed. Now, light would return to China. But light can be blinding. The new emperor, now known by his reign title Hongwu, vastly martial, believed deeply in the necessity of control. He had lived through hunger, chaos, and betrayal, and he carried those memories like scars. To him, order was the only way to prevent history from repeating itself. He established a strict code of laws, rooted in Confucian ideals, that dictated every aspect of life, from the duties of officials to the behavior of farmers. Corruption, once tolerated, was now punishable by death. Bureaucrats who grew too rich or too independent were purged. Even minor disobedience could be seen as rebellion against the will of heaven. Yet, paradoxically, these same harsh measures brought stability. The granaries were refilled, the rivers repaired, the fields replanted. For the first time in a generation, families could live without fear of starvation. The emperor, both feared and revered, had restored the rhythm of life. Still, beneath the surface of renewal lay a quiet tension. The Hongwu emperor's rule was absolute, but it was also fragile. He trusted no one completely, not his generals, not his ministers, sometimes not even his own sons. His paranoia grew with his power. He believed that the very forces that had corrupted the Yuan would someday seek to corrupt the Ming. So he watched his empire with an unblinking eye, issuing edicts that reached into every village and family. His spies listened for whispers of discontent. His secret police investigated rumors of rebellion. And when he struck without hesitation. Thousands of officials were executed in the name of purity and order. The people rejoiced at peace, but they also learned to live in silence. Yet for all his cruelty, there was wisdom in Hong's rule. He saw clearly what many emperors could not, that an empire's true strength lay not in its armies, but in the hearts of its people. He redistributed land from the wealthy to the poor, re-established systems of education to train new scholars, and restored the ancient examinations that allowed commoners to rise into government service. He revived the Confucian dream of a moral society where each person fulfilled their role in harmony with others. Farmers farmed, scholars studied, officials served, and the emperor ruled, all bound by duty. It was a vision of cosmic order reborn. The world began to take notice. Across Asia, kingdoms watched as China rose from ruin to radiance. Trade routes reopened, stretching from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the deserts of Central Asia. Silk, porcelain, and tea once again flowed through ports and markets, carrying with them the promise of prosperity. To the west, far beyond China's borders, travelers would later whisper of the great Ming of a civilization that had rebuilt itself from ashes and now stood as a beacon of brilliance in a darkened world. But even as China healed, the world beyond its mountains and seas was stirring in unfamiliar ways. In distant lands, ships were beginning to test the limits of the horizon. Kingdoms once separated by deserts and oceans were starting to look outward, their eyes fixed on the unknown. For now, China remained the center of the world, proud and self-sufficient. Yet in time, the dynasty that rebuilt its empire would also face forces from beyond its imagination. In the quiet evenings of early Ming China, as lanterns flickered along the canals of Nanjing, and the scent of jasmine drifted through the imperial gardens, the people believed they were living in an age blessed by heaven itself. They told their children that the darkness was gone, that the empire would last for 10,000 years. And perhaps for a moment, it seemed true. The rivers ran clear, the fields were green again, and the emperor's decrees carried the weight of divine order. But history, as ever, moves in cycles. The same winds that once brought ruin to the Yuan would someday whisper again through the corridors of power. For now, though, the Middle Kingdom breathed in peace, reborn beneath the shining light of the Ming. The emperor who dreamed of a perfect world. There are rulers who build empires through conquest, and then there are rulers who try to perfect them through vision. The Ming Dynasty, after its birth in fire and famine, stood upon the ashes of the old world with one question echoing across its grand, rebuilt cities. What should a perfect empire look like? The Hongwu emperor had given China its stability, but stability alone could not sustain the heart of a civilization that had seen both the glories of the Tang and the tragedies of the Yuan. What came next was not merely rule, it was an experiment in harmony between human will and the heavens themselves. The Ming sought to rebuild not just roads and walls, but the moral universe of the Chinese world. When Hongwu's reign began to wane, his mind turned more and more toward legacy. He had seen the dangers of disorder, the cruelty of greed, and the frailty of men. And so he attempted to craft an empire that would survive his own mortality. His ideal world was one of clarity and empire, so precisely ordered that it would function almost without human corruption. He built a bureaucratic machine that penetrated every level of Chinese life, from the mighty ministers of the Forbidden City to the humble farmers of the southern valleys. Every man's role was defined, his duty prescribed, his loyalty demanded. But beneath the surface of this order lay a tension that no decree could silence. The human heart cannot be measured by laws alone. As the Hongwu emperor aged, he became increasingly distrustful of those around him. He had executed many of his advisors, suspecting plots that may or may not have existed. The very machinery he had built to ensure stability was turning into a web of fear. When his chosen heir died young, the question of succession opened a quiet storm within the royal court. After Hongwu's death in 1398, his grandson, the Jianwen emperor, ascended the throne, a gentle and thoughtful young man who dreamed not of domination, but of reform. He believed that the empire his grandfather had forged with iron could now be refined with reason and compassion. He reduced the harsh punishments, sought to limit the power of the feudal princes, and attempted to replace fear with trust. But in the shadows, one man watched these changes with cold calculation. The Prince of Yan, Zhu Di, the son of Hongwu, and the commander of China's northern armies. Zhu Di was everything his nephew was not: bold, cunning, and born to command. Stationed in Beiping, the northern stronghold guarding the frontier against Mongol raiders, he had spent his life among soldiers and scholars, balancing the art of war with the discipline of Confucian order. He understood both the weakness of his nephew's reforms and the danger of losing control over the empire as far-flung provinces. When the Jingwen emperor began stripping power from the princes, Zhu Di saw not reform, but betrayal. In his mind, his father's hard-won order was being undone by idealism. And so, in the year 1399, the fires of rebellion once again lit the skies of China. The war between uncle and nephew would come to be known as the Jingnan Rebellion, the campaign to pacify the difficulties. It lasted 4 years and tore apart the fragile unity that Hongwu had built. Zhu Di's armies marched south, crossing rivers and mountains, besieging cities that had sworn loyalty to the young emperor. Propaganda and spies played their own invisible war in the background, priests spreading omens, scholars writing tracts, proclaiming the mandate of heaven had shifted. In the chaos of 1402, the capital, Nanjing, fell. The imperial palace burned. The Jianwen emperor vanished. Some said he perished in the flames. Others whispered he escaped, wandering the world as a monk, a ghost of a fallen dream. Zhu Di took the throne, declaring himself the Yongle Emperor, perpetual happiness. Yet his ascent, born from blood and smoke, would forever haunt him. From the moment he claimed the dragon throne, Yongle knew he needed to prove his legitimacy, not just to his subjects, but to heaven itself. To wash away the stains of rebellion, he embarked on one of the most ambitious rebuilding projects in history. He moved the capital north to Beiping, renaming it Beijing, the northern capital, and began the construction of a city that would symbolize the perfection of his rule, the Forbidden City. It was not just a palace. It was a universe made of stone and symmetry, designed to reflect the cosmic order of the heavens. Every gate, courtyard, and chamber was aligned with celestial geometry. To enter it was to walk through a vision of divine harmony. Here, the emperor would sit at the center of all things, the bridge between heaven and earth. Yongle's vision for the Ming Empire stretched far beyond its borders. Where his father had been suspicious of the outside world, Yongle was fascinated by it. He saw China not as a nation isolated by mountains and seas, but as the center of a vast, interconnected realm. To demonstrate the empire's power and virtue, he commissioned massive fleets, great armadas of treasure ships that would sail across the oceans to distant lands. The man chosen to lead these expeditions was Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan who had once served in Yongle's court. Under his command, the Ming fleets became floating cities, carrying silk, porcelain, and gifts of gold to the shores of Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and even the coast of Africa. These were not voyages of conquest, but of diplomacy and spectacle. Wherever Zheng He's ships landed, they announced the presence of the Middle Kingdom, a civilization reborn and resplendent. At home, Yongle's ambitions were no less grand. He revived the civil service examinations, ensuring that scholars of virtue and talent, not merely birth, could rise to serve the empire. He ordered the compilation of the Yongle Dadian, the Yongle Encyclopedia, an immense collection of knowledge encompassing philosophy, science, history, medicine, and art. It was the largest encyclopedia the world had ever seen, a monument not of stone, but of wisdom. In its pages, he sought to preserve everything China had ever learned, to ensure that the brilliance of civilization would never again be lost to war and chaos. To Yongle, knowledge was as sacred as power. Yet even as the empire flourished under his rule, the emperor himself was restless. He was a man haunted by the rebellion that brought him to power. Dreams of fire and ghosts plagued his nights. Rumors persisted that the rightful emperor still lived, and Yongle's spies scoured the land for him in vain. He compensated for this guilt through relentless action-building, exploring, conquering, reforming driven by an almost divine urgency to prove that his reign was destined. He launched massive military campaigns into Mongolia, seeking to secure China's northern frontier once and for all. His armies marched deep into the steppe, battling old enemies under the vast skies his ancestors had once feared. Yet the north remained a place that could not be tamed, a reminder that beyond China's borders, there was always a world untamed and unpredictable. As the years passed, Yongle's grandeur became his burden. The vast construction projects drained the treasury. The fleets cost fortunes to build and maintain, and the military campaigns bled men and resources. The emperor's health began to fail, but his will did not. He continued to dream of eternal harmony, of a world where every man, every law, every wall was perfectly aligned with the celestial order. When he died in 1424, far from home on a northern campaign, his death marked the end of an age of expansion. The man who had dreamed of eternal happiness had spent his life fighting the ghosts of imperfection. But his legacy endured. The Forbidden City stood as a masterpiece of human ambition, a silent, symmetrical poem written in gold and jade. The Ming Navy's voyages had stretched China's shadow across oceans that most of the world had never dared to cross. The Yongle Encyclopedia had gathered the wisdom of millennia into the hands of scribes who believed that knowledge itself was a form of immortality. For a brief moment, China stood not just as a kingdom, but as the heart of the known world. In the quiet decades that followed Yongel's death, the empire turned inward. The great ships were recalled, their logs sealed, their memories fading into legend. The walls of the Forbidden City, once symbols of connection, began to feel like boundaries. Yet even in isolation, the dream of perfection lingered. The Ming had rebuilt China from the wreckage of invasion and fun, rebellion, and had projected its light to the very edges of the known world. They had shown that civilization could rise again, not through conquest, but through discipline, vision, and belief. In the silence of the Forbidden City, as the morning sun painted the golden rooftops in light, the echoes of Yongel's dream still whispered through its halls. A dream of order so perfect, it might one day defy time itself. And yet, beneath the perfection, history waited, as it always does, for the next turn of the wheel. The dream turns inward history, often whispers before it shouts. The Ming Dynasty, after its brilliant dawn under the Yongle Emperor, stood bathed in a golden light that blinded even those who lived within it. The great ships had sailed across oceans. The Forbidden City gleamed like a second sun, and scholars spoke of the empire as the axis of civilization itself. Yet, like the steady fading of day into twilight, every golden age carries within it the seeds of its own decline. The dream that had once propelled the Ming outward, to explore, to create, to connect, began to turn inward, folding upon itself in fear, bureaucracy, and the quiet weight of preservation. What began as the perfection of order slowly hardened into its prison. When the Yongle Emperor's body was returned to the capital, wrapped in imperial silk and carried under banners proclaiming perpetual happiness, the empire felt a tremor of unease. His death marked not just the passing of a ruler, but the closing of an era of movement. The grand fleets that had once carried the dragon flag across the seas were ordered to return. The shipyards that had built them fell silent, their timbers left to rot in the humid air. By the time of the Xuandi Emperor, Yongle's grandson, the Ming court had already begun to question whether such voyages were worth the expense. Why seek the world beyond when all that truly mattered was within the walls of China itself? The logic seemed sound at first. The empire was vast, prosperous, and secure. The tribute missions from foreign lands had already confirmed China's supremacy. There was, it seemed, nothing more to prove. And yet, behind that confidence lay anxiety, a fear of the unknown, of overreach, of change. The same walls that had once symbolized stability began to symbolize something else: containment. The Ming rulers who followed Yongle were scholars more than warriors, caretakers more than conquerors. They saw their duty as preserving the perfection that had already been achieved, not in risking it by venturing beyond. The court's attention turned inward, to administration, to ritual, to moral philosophy. The civil service bureaucracy, once a shining instrument of merit and order, began to swell into an endless machine of paperwork and politics. Thousands of officials governed millions of people, their lives bound by forms, seals, and endless reports. The ideal of the Confucian scholar official, a man of virtue and reason guiding the empire with wisdom, was replaced by a class of career bureaucrats who measured success not in deeds but in documents. To serve the state became an act of navigating regulations rather than governing people. It was civilization made static, like a painting admired but never altered. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, China's people continued their timeless rhythms. Farmers rose with the dawn to till the fields. Merchants carried goods along the Grand Canal. Artisans crafted porcelain that would one day find its way to far-off lands. The empire's heartbeat was steady, but its pulse was slow. While Europe would soon ignite with the fires of the Renaissance and the age of exploration, China withdrew into its own perfection, confident that the rest of the world had little to offer. The oceans that Zheng He had once crossed now became forbidden waters. The official stance was simple but telling. Foreign voyages were unnecessary. The world should come to China, not the other way around. And yet, within that vast stillness, not all was serene. The Mongols to the north, though broken, remained restless. Bandits haunted the countryside. Local corruption festered in the shadows of bureaucracy. The empire's wealth was immense, but so was its waste. Taxes grew heavier, and the people's burden deepened. Still, the court believed that strict adherence to order would hold chaos at bay. The emperors who followed Yongle sought peace through isolation, control through ritual, and stability through silence. The dream of expansion became a dream of preservation. One of the most telling signs of this transformation was the empire's relationship with its own walls, literal and metaphorical. Under the later Ming emperors, construction on the Great Wall intensified. What had once been a patchwork of earthen fortifications became, for the first time, a unified, continuous barrier of stone, brick, and watchtowers stretching thousands of miles. It was an engineering marvel, a monument to human will and fear alike. Every brick laid was an act of both pride and paranoia. The Great Wall was not just meant to keep the Mongols out. It was a statement to heaven itself that the Ming had the power to control the boundaries of civilization. Inside was order, harmony, and the light of culture. Outside was chaos, barbarism, and the shadow of the unknown. But walls are deceptive things. They protect as much as they isolate. And over time, they reshape the minds of those who live behind them. The Ming world became one defined by boundaries. Scholars were discouraged from speculative thought. Artists and writers, once daring in their visions, now conformed to established forms. Innovation became suspect. Anything that threatened the established order was quietly discouraged or condemned. The emperor was to be obeyed, the past was to be revered, and the present was to remain unchanged. Yet beneath that calm surface, subtle currents of change still flowed. The empire's population was growing rapidly. Agricultural innovations, like the introduction of new crops from abroad, sweet potatoes, maize, and peanuts, began to transform the countryside. These changes allowed more people to survive, but they also placed new pressures on the land and the state. With more mouths to feed came more demands on the bureaucracy. Local officials struggled to maintain order in a system designed for a smaller, simpler world. The Ming, in its effort to perfect governance, had created a structure too rigid to adapt. In the Forbidden City, emperors became increasingly withdrawn. The palaces, once filled with scholars debating philosophy and ministers advising on policy, grew quieter. The rulers of the mid-Ming era, such as the Zheng Tong and Jiajing emperors, were more interested in their personal pursuits than the burdens of governance. Some became obsessed with Taoist alchemy and immortality, spending vast sums on elixirs said to grant eternal life. Others retreated into ritual, performing ceremonies meant to maintain harmony with heaven, while ignoring the discontent rising among the people. This inward turn was not unique to the throne. The entire culture began to fold inward upon itself, finding refuge in introspection. The Ming literati, facing a world that no longer celebrated bold ideas, turned to perfection of form. Painters sought to capture not new subjects, but new subtleties within old ones, the brushwork, the void, the suggestion of mountains through mist. Scholars turned their attention to moral refinement, seeking purity of thought rather than innovation. Even architecture became introspective. The sprawling imperial complexes gave way to gardens, spaces of reflection rather than expansion. The most famous of these, the humble administrator's garden in Seoul, symbolized the entire era, a miniature world, perfectly balanced, carefully ordered, and deeply personal. Yet, history has a way of punishing stillness. While the Ming turned inward, the world around them was changing. Across the oceans they had once ruled, the Portuguese and Spanish were carving global empires, mapping coasts, and opening trade routes that would reshape history. Gunpowder, once a Chinese invention, was transforming warfare in Europe and the Islamic world. The global balance of power was shifting, and China, once the center, was slowly becoming an island of its own perfection, adrift from the tides of change. Still, for those living within the Ming realm, the illusion of permanence persisted. The empire was rich, its cities vibrant, its culture refined. Silk, porcelain, and tea flowed outward along trade routes that stretched to the edges of the known world. Foreign merchants arrived at China's ports, humbled by the grandeur they encountered. To the Ming court, these men were curiosity's proof of China's superiority. But to the world beyond, they were glimpses of something to covet, something to challenge. The seeds of future conflict were being quietly sown in the same soil that grew China's confidence. The Ming had inherited from their ancestors the belief that history moves in cycles, the rise and fall of dynasties as reflections of moral virtue or its decay. By the middle of the dynasty's reign, signs of imbalance began to appear. Natural disasters were interpreted as warnings from heaven. Floods, famines, and locust swarms were said to be messages, urging the emperor to restore virtue and reform governance. But reform was no longer in fashion. The system was too vast, too entrenched, too dependent on its own inertia. The dream of a perfect empire had become an empire that feared waking up. And yet, within that dream, there were still flashes of brilliance. Great scholars continued to write. Artists painted masterpieces that would inspire centuries to come. Engineers improved irrigation, craftsmen perfected porcelain techniques, and the economy continued to hum with quiet efficiency. For every sign of decay, there was another of endurance. Civilization does not die all at once. It drifts, slowly, like a great river winding toward the sea. By the 16th century, as the world entered an age of discovery and confrontation, the Ming world was poised on the edge of something it could neither see nor prepare for. The empire that had once sent ships across the oceans now struggled to defend its own shores. Pirates, Chinese and foreign, alike raided the coasts. Corruption reached new heights as officials sold offices and manipulated taxes for personal gain. Yet even then, the court clung to its rituals, believing that if the ceremonies of heaven were performed perfectly, the world would right itself once more. It was an illusion of control, beautiful, dignified, and doomed. The dream had indeed turned inward. What had begun as the Ming's greatest strength, its devotion to order, had become its quiet weakness. But history was not finished with China, nor with the dynasty that had rebuilt it from ashes. Far beyond the empire's borders, forces were gathering new powers, new technologies, and new ideas that would one day test the walls of the Middle Kingdom and the endurance of its dream. In the centuries to come, the Ming would face not just invasion and rebellion, but transformation. The world would arrive at China's gates once more, demanding that it rejoin the tides of history it had tried so long to resist. And when that moment came, the question would no longer be whether the Ming could preserve its perfection, but whether it could survive its own reflection. The wall and the sea. The Ming confronts a changing world. It begins with wind, cold, sharp, carrying the dust of the northern plains and the salt of the southern coast. Somewhere between these two vast frontiers stood China, the heart of the Ming world, proud and powerful, yet increasingly uncertain about which direction the world was turning. To the north, endless walls of stone and watchtowers sliced across mountains like scars upon the land, standing as silent sentinels against the eternal threat of invasion. To the south, the restless sea whispered of opportunity, of voyages beyond imagination, and of strangers sailing from lands once thought unreachable. This was a dynasty standing at the edge of the old world, watching the first waves of a new one rise. The Ming had long seen themselves as the center of civilization, the Middle Kingdom, encircled by barbarians who either paid tribute or were kept at bay by the Great Wall. Yet as the 15th century gave way to the 16th, the idea of isolation began to tremble. The threats that once came only from the steppe were now arriving by sea, carried by ships with strange sails and even stranger ambitions. But before China could confront these outsiders, it had to confront itself, its fears, its pride, and its vision of destiny. The same empire that once sent treasure fleets across oceans was now turning inward, questioning the very purpose of contact with the world. The Great Wall, as it came to be rebuilt under the Ming, was not just a defense system. It was a statement, an immense expression of willpower, ambition, and anxiety. Thousands of miles long, its stones were laid by countless hands, peasants, soldiers, and prisoners alike, forming a monument to vigilance. Every tower was a heartbeat, every beacon a memory of past invasions. It was as though the Ming were trying to build not just a wall of earth and brick, but a barrier against time itself, to hold back the changing tides of history. Each emperor who strengthened it believed they were preserving China's soul, even as the cost in lives and silver grew unbearable. But the wall was also a mirror, reflecting the Ming's internal contradictions. The same dynasty that poured its might into defending the north was quietly losing grip of the sea. Decades earlier, under the Yongle Emperor, the legendary Zheng He had commanded vast fleets that sailed across the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as the Swahili coast of Africa. Those ships were symbols of confidence, of an empire unafraid to show its grandeur to the world. Yet by the late 15th century, those same harbors had fallen silent. The grand shipyards of Nanjing lay in decay, their timbers rotting, their docks empty. The Ming court had turned its gaze away from the horizon and toward the mountains. The empire that once reached outward was now building inward. It wasn't merely fear that caused this shift, it was philosophy. The scholar officials who guided the Ming court were deeply shaped by Confucian ideals, which valued order, hierarchy, and stability above all. To them, the sea represented chaos, a place of merchants, pirates, and unpredictable influences. The open ocean could not be controlled by rights or bureaucratic structure. It was, in their minds, a realm that diluted virtue. So the empire retreated into its rituals, reinforcing a world where harmony meant control and peace meant distance. Yet, unbeknownst to them, beyond those waters, a revolution was stirring. Far across the oceans, in lands the Ming had scarcely imagined, Europe was awakening. The Portuguese, with their small but formidable caravels, were carving routes around Africa. The Spanish were crossing the vast Pacific from the newly conquered Americas. The world was expanding, and sooner or later it would reach China's shores. When the first Portuguese ships appeared near the southern coasts around 1514, local officials were unsure what to make of them. Their sails were unlike anything seen before, and their cannons thundered with the voice of the future. To the Chinese, these newcomers were barbarians, crude, loud, yet strangely determined. They came not with tribute, but with trade, and behind their trade was ambition. At first, the Ming tried to treat them like any other tributary power, expecting them to bow to the emperor's order. But the Portuguese were merchants, not diplomats. They wanted ports, silver, and spices, not ceremonies. When diplomacy failed, violence followed. In 1517, an attempt to establish formal relations ended in blood. The Ming navy attacked and drove the Portuguese away. But the barbarians returned again and again, each time with more ships, better weapons, and deeper resolve. By the 1550s, they had established a foothold at Macau, a small but vital outpost that would become the first European colony in Chinese territory. While the southern coast began to hum with the foreign presence, the northern borders still echoed with old dangers. The Mongols, though fragmented, were far from defeated. Raids continued, and the wall became both shield and symbol. Its watchtowers glowed at night with the fire of warning signals, creating a chain of light stretching across the spine of the empire. Inside those walls, life was hard. Soldiers patrolled endless stretches of barren land, far from their families, their only companions the wind and the sand. The wall, majestic as it appeared from a distance, was also a prison of duty. Yet it held for a time. Within the forbidden city, emperors wrestled with their own walls, not of stone, but of thought. The Ming bureaucracy was immense, filled with scholars whose pens carried as much power as swords. Every decision was filtered through debate and moral discourse. Should the empire open to foreign trade or shut itself away? Should it invest in the navy or fortify the land? The debates were endless, and so often, indecision won. By the 16th century, the empire's economic heart was shifting. The influx of silver from the Spanish Americas, carried through Manila by Chinese merchants, transformed China's economy. Trade, once dismissed as vulgar, became the empire's lifeblood, even as its moral guardians tried to deny it. This was the paradox of the late Ming world. An empire that tried to shut out the world, yet found itself more entangled with it than ever before. Merchants in Fujian and Guangdong grew wealthy trading silk and porcelain for silver. Smugglers and pirates, known as Woko, thrived in the shadows between legality and rebellion. And while officials condemned them as lawless, they often relied on their silver to keep the economy flowing. The empire's moral order was cracking, but its material world was thriving. The Ming had built a wall to protect themselves, yet prosperity flowed through the cracks. As the empire faced outward threats, it also faced inward decay. Corruption spread through the ranks. Eunuchs within the court grew powerful, manipulating emperors and exploiting commoners. Taxes rose, peasants suffered, and rebellion simmered. The grandeur of the Great Wall, for all its strength, could not defend against the weakening of spirit within. The wall was a monument to vigilance, but it could not protect against complacency. And yet, amid all this tension, there was beauty, a kind of tragic brilliance that defined the Ming era. Its artists painted dreamlike landscapes, where mist rolled over mountains and scholars sat beneath pines in quiet contemplation. Its poets wrote of isolation and longing, their verses filled with the melancholy of a civilization aware of its own fragility. Its craftsmen perfected porcelain so fine that it became the envy of the world. The Ming's art was its soul, delicate yet enduring, like the very walls it built. In its paintings and poetry, the dynasty spoke not of conquest or power, but of reflection. Perhaps that was its greatest strength and its greatest flaw. Then came the missionaries, the Jesuits, bringing not guns or gold, but knowledge. When Matteo Ricci arrived in China in the late 16th century, he came dressed not as a conqueror, but as a scholar. Fluent in Mandarin, versed in astronomy, geometry, and philosophy, Ricci earned the respect of the Chinese elite. Through him and others, the worlds of East and West began to meet, cautiously, curiously, and intellectually. They exchanged maps, clocks, and ideas. The Ming scholars marveled at European instruments, while the Jesuits marveled at China's moral order. For a brief moment, it seemed as if two civilizations, each convinced of its superiority, could look at one another and see equals. But harmony was fleeting. Beneath the polite exchange of knowledge lay the deeper currents of change: trade, religion, ambition. The world beyond China was no longer distant or deferential. It was restless, expanding, driven by forces that would soon reshape everything. The Great Wall, once the edge of the known world, was becoming a relic, an echo of a time when boundaries seemed eternal. The sea, once feared, was now the true frontier, and beyond it lay empires that did not believe in staying still. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Ming stood on uneasy ground. It had rebuilt China from the ashes of Mongol rule, restored order, art, and power, but in doing so, It had built a cage of its own making. Its walls, physical, cultural, and political, had protected it for centuries, but they also kept it from adapting. The dynasty that had once commanded oceans now struggled to comprehend the new world being born beyond its horizon. It was as if China stood upon the wall itself, looking out across the windswept plains to the north and the infinite sea to the south, unsure of which direction led to survival. And somewhere within that uncertainty, history began to turn once again. The storms that would one day consume the Ming were already forming, quiet at first, like the distant rumble of thunder over the sea. Yet even as those clouds gathered, the empire's heart still beat with an ancient rhythm, believing that it could outlast time itself. The walls stood, the sea shimmered, and the Ming endured, for now. The silver tide and the shadow within, there are moments in history when the world changes not with an explosion, but with the soft ring of metal, the sound of coins clinking together, the whisper of silver flowing across continents. For the Ming Dynasty, that sound became both its heartbeat and its curse. The rise of the global silver trade in the 16th century was not just an economic phenomenon. It was a quiet revolution that reshaped empires, rewrote power, and bound distant worlds together through a currency no one had intended to worship. China became the center of that web, a civilization of immense production and insatiable demand, drawing silver like the moon pulls the tide. But as that tide rose, so too did shadows within the empire, corruption, inequality, and unrest eroding the very foundations of Ming power. It began with a decision that seemed small, even wise. To simplify taxes and stabilize revenue, the Ming government decreed that most taxes should be paid in silver instead of goods or grain. On paper, it was elegant. Silver was stable, universal, and easier to collect. In practice, it tied the fate of China as economy to the veins of silver flowing in from across the world, veins that the Ming could not control. This one reform quietly linked China's destiny to faraway mines in the mountains of Bolivia and the jungles of the Philippines. For the first time in history, a farmer in Jiangxi and a miner in Potosi were part of the same economic story, though neither would ever know the other existed. At first, it worked beautifully. Trade flourished. Merchants carried silk, tea, and porcelain across Asia, while European traders, especially the Portuguese and the Spanish, carried silver back from the Americas. Chinese artisans produced goods so exquisite that they became the gold standard of luxury. In return, ships arrived laden with chests of pure silver. The empire grew wealthy. The markets of Nanjing, Suzhou, and Hangzhou thrummed with life, their streets crowded with traders shouting in a dozen languages. China, already ancient, became the beating heart of a new global economy, a silent empire fueling a connected world. But beneath the shimmer of prosperity, the silver tide carried danger. Because the Ming government produced little silver of its own, it depended on a steady flow from abroad. When that flow was strong, prices were stable and trade thrived. But when it faltered, due to wars, piracy, or the collapse of European supply, the Chinese economy shook. Farmers who once paid their taxes in grain suddenly found themselves at the mercy of silver's price, which could double overnight. A drought in Spain or a rebellion in Peru could send ripples of hunger across China. The empire that once saw itself as self-sufficient was now tethered to the fate of strangers across the seas. And then came the pirates. Along the southern coast, where imperial control was weakest, the Woko, the so-called Japanese pirates, multiplied. Many were not Japanese at all, but desperate Chinese merchants and smugglers banned from foreign trade. Officially, maritime commerce outside the tribute system was illegal. In reality, it was irresistible. Smuggling became a lifeline for those who could not survive within the bureaucracy's rules. But with wealth came violence. Coastal towns burned. Trade routes turned dangerous. The government, blinded by ideology and corruption, could not tell the difference between merchant and raider. To them, all who sailed without permission were enemies. It was as if the empire's own arteries were clogged by the very wealth it sought to control. In the Forbidden City, behind its golden roofs and marble steps, the court drifted further from the world beyond its walls. Emperors came and went, some ambitious, others withdrawn. The bureaucrats who ran the state were brilliant scholars, but poor economists. They could recite the Analects, but not balance the treasury. The real power increasingly fell into the hands of eunuchs, men without families or legacies, who served the emperor alone and wielded fear like a blade. They built private armies, sold offices, and bled the provinces dry. The silver that poured into China's ports was supposed to fill the imperial coffers. Instead, it vanished into hidden vaults and personal estates. The most infamous of these figures was Wei Zhongshan, a eunuch whose influence under the Tianqi emperor grew so vast that he was called the 9,000-year-old. He controlled appointments, silenced critics, and filled the palace with his spies. To oppose him was to disappear. Scholars who spoke out were flogged, exiled, or executed. The ideals of Confucian virtue that once guided the Ming court had turned into hollow ceremony. The empire's moral compass had been sold for silver. And outside the capital, famine and discontent were spreading like cracks in an ancient vase. The late Ming countryside was a paradox, fertile, populous, yet perpetually on the edge of collapse. Population growth outpaced resources. Land became scarce, rents rose, and peasants sank into debt. When drought struck, or when locusts devoured the crops, entire villages starved. The state's granaries, meant to provide relief, were often empty, their stores sold off by corrupt officials. Silver, once a symbol of stability, now deepened inequality. The rich hoarded it, the poor could not afford it, and tax collectors demanded it all the same. As one chronicler lamented, the people die of taxes before they die of hunger. Still, the cities glowed with wealth. Ming China was home to one of the most vibrant, urban cultures in the premodern world. Theaters flourished, printing presses spread literature, and painters captured scenes of everyday life with astonishing realism. The scholar gentry of Suzhou and Hanzhou lived like princes, surrounded by art, music, and philosophy. But this cultural golden age was built on fragile foundations, a glittering surface concealing deep rot beneath. The empire's stability depended on the illusion that it was eternal. Yet history, as always, had other plans. As the 17th century dawned, the silver tide began to recede. In the 1620s, European wars disrupted trade, and the flow of bullion from the Americas slowed dramatically. The price of silver in China soared. Farmers could no longer pay their taxes. Merchants went bankrupt, and the government's revenue collapsed. Inflation and famine followed. Desperate peasants rose in rebellion, forming roving armies that looted granaries and burned cities. From Shaanxi to Henan, the land erupted in chaos. What had once been an empire of order and ceremony now trembled under the weight of its own contradictions. Among these rebels emerged a name that would soon haunt the Ming, Li Zihong. Born a poor herdsman, Li rose to command a massive force of starving peasants and disillusioned soldiers. His banner promised justice, to kill the corrupt and help the people. To the suffering masses, he was a savior. To the Ming court, he was a nightmare. His rebellion swept through the heart of China like wildfire, exposing the emptiness of imperial authority. The wall could not stop him, the bureaucracy could not control him, and the court could not understand him. The Ming had built its defenses against the outside world, never imagining that its true destruction would come from within. Even as rebellion spread, another storm gathered beyond the northern frontier. The Manchus, descendants of the Jurchen tribes who had once served the Ming, were rising under a brilliant leader named Narashi. They were disciplined, organized, and hungry for revenge. While the Ming wasted its strength fighting its own people, the Manchus built an empire in waiting. They learned Chinese tactics, adopted Chinese bureaucracy, and prepared for the day when the Dragon Throne would be theirs. Back in Beijing, the last Ming emperors faced the impossible. They tried to raise armies, but their coffers were empty. They ordered reforms, but it was too late. The silver that once symbolized global prestige had turned into a poison coursing through their veins. Every shipment that arrived from Manila or Macau felt like a drop of salvation, yet it could not heal the disease of corruption and despair. The world economy had created a monster, an empire dependent on foreign wealth, but unable to sustain itself without it. And still, amid all this decay, there remained moments of grace, scenes that history often forgets. A scholar painting under candlelight, writing poems about loss and impermanence. A farmer in the south, clutching a silver coin, wondering why it feels lighter every year. A merchant gazing at the horizon, waiting for ships that never come. The empire lived on in these quiet fragments, each one carrying a trace of the grandeur that once defined the Ming world. Even as the walls cracked, even as the banners of rebellion approached, the people still dreamed of peace, of balance, of heaven's favor returning once more. By the late 1630s, the dynasty stood on the brink. The once great wall was crumbling, both in stone and in spirit. The imperial capital was a hollow shell, where eunuchs plotted, scholars whispered, and the emperor prayed. The silver tide had risen and fallen, leaving behind only the shadow of its glitter. What had begun as a reform meant to strengthen the empire had, over a century, ensnared it in the invisible web of global trade, a web that now strangled the very civilization that had seemed unshakable. The Ming, proud and eternal, was collapsing, not because it was conquered, but because it could no longer carry the weight of its own contradictions. And yet, as history has shown time and again, even in collapse, there is rebirth. In the ashes of empire, new orders are born. As the dragon's banner fell, a new one, strange, foreign, yet familiar, began to rise in the north. The Manchus were coming, and with them, the world itself would change again. But that story, the fall of the Ming and the dawn of the Qing, was not one of conquest alone. It was the end of an age, and the beginning of a new chapter in the endless rhythm of China's rise, fall, and rebirth. The fall of the dragon, the last days of the Ming. There are moments in history when an empire does not fall with a roar, but with a sigh, when centuries of splendor fade like the last glow of sunset on an ancient wall. The Ming Dynasty, which had once rebuilt China after chaos and shone as one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the world, began its final descent in quiet tragedy. It was not defeated by an enemy's sword alone, but by something far more delicate: exhaustion, corruption, and the unbearable weight of its own grandeur. By the middle of the 17th century, the empire that had once seemed eternal stood trembling, its dragon banners tattered by wind and memory. The Chongzhen Emperor ascended the throne in 1627, a young man of sharp mind and noble intent. He inherited not a realm of strength, but one already sick at its core. His predecessors had drowned in pleasure, neglecting governance, leaving behind empty treasuries and disillusioned officials. The eunuchs who had once been servants had become masters, controlling armies, wealth, and whispers. The bureaucracy, once the envy of the world, had turned inward, obsessed with hierarchy and etiquette while the people starved. And outside the palace walls, famine and rebellion spread like cracks in the porcelain surface of the state. The emperor faced a mountain of crises, and a world that no longer believed in him. Still, he tried. The Chongzhen Emperor rose before dawn, reading reports deep into the night, dismissing corrupt eunuchs, recalling loyal ministers. He sought to purify the court, to restore order and dignity. But he was one man against an ocean. Each reform he attempted was drowned by factionalism, each decision sabotaged by the endless quarrels of scholar officials who cared more for ideology than survival. The Confucian elite split into bitter camps, each claiming to defend virtue while secretly plotting against rivals. Loyalty became theater, and the bureaucracy, paralyzed by pride, refused to act. The emperor found himself increasingly alone, a lonely figure at the heart of an empire that no longer listened. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of the Forbidden City, the world was unraveling. Drought gripped the northern provinces. Crops failed, granaries emptied, and taxes still came due, in silver that no one possessed. Desperate farmers sold their land, their children, their freedom. Those who could not pay fled, joining bands of vagabonds and bandits. These outlaws became armies. Their hunger turned into fury. From Shanxi to Henan, rebellion blazed like wildfire. Among the countless insurgent leaders, one name began to echo through the empire: Li Ziking, the dashing king. Li had been a postman once, humble and invisible. But hunger and cruelty had transformed him into something else, a man of destiny, molded by desperation. His armies, ragged and barefoot, fought with the strength of those who had nothing left to lose. To peasants broken by starvation, he was not a rebel, he was hope. His proclamations promised relief, the end of taxes, the punishment of corrupt officials. His army swept across the heartland, unstoppable not because of its power, but because of the people's faith. The Ming armies sent to crush him often joined his ranks instead, unwilling to die for a government that had already abandoned them. As rebellion spread, the Ming court turned inward. The emperor's advisors bickered over rituals and regulations, while cities fell one after another. Reports of disaster arrived daily, each more desperate than the last. But the emperor, proud and idealistic, refused to flee. He believed that duty required him to stand firm, even as the ground gave way beneath him. He called for loyalty, yet trusted no one. He executed generals for failure, alienated allies with suspicion, and surrounded himself with fear. His court became a ghostly place, empty corridors echoing with the shuffle of servants, the flicker of candlelight on marble, the faint sound of weeping in the distance. In 1644, the end arrived not with ceremony, but with a storm. Li Zikang's army marched on Beijing. The imperial defenses, hollow from years of neglect, crumbled, almost without resistance. The capital, once the heart of the world's greatest empire, stood defenseless. Within the Forbidden City, panic reigned. Ministers fled, soldiers deserted, and courtiers begged the emperor to escape to the south and rebuild. But Chongqing refused. "I will not be remembered as the one who abandoned my ancestors' throne," he said. His words were calm, but his eyes were empty, the eyes of a man who had already seen his empire die. On the night of April 25th, as Li's forces breached the city gates, Chongqing climbed Jingshan Hill, the small artificial mountain behind the Forbidden City. The sky was dark, heavy with smoke and dust. He wore his imperial robes, though torn and stained. His attendants had all fled. Only a few eunuchs remained. He looked out over the burning city, his city, and whispered, "I have failed my ancestors. How can I face them in death?" Then, beneath a twisted locust tree, he took off his crown, tied a sash around his neck, and hanged himself. When they found him the next morning, his body swayed gently in the dawn wind, the dragon of his robe fluttering against the ashes. The last emperor of the Ming had fallen, not in battle, but in silence. A man destroyed by loyalty, solitude, and fate. Beijing surrendered soon after. Li Ziking declared himself ruler of a new dynasty, the Shun. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the people's revolution had triumphed. But power, once seized, is never easily kept. The same peasants who had followed Li in hunger now demanded order, justice, and food he could not provide. His soldiers, untrained and undisciplined, turned to looting. The dream of a new age curdled into chaos. And far to the northeast, another power watched and waited, the Manchus, whose banners had long gathered at the empire's edge. The Manchus were not mere invaders. They had studied China for decades, its systems, its rituals, its weaknesses. Their leader, Dorgan, understood that conquest required not only force, but legitimacy. When Ming generals, desperate to avenge their fallen emperor, opened the Great Wall to seek Manchu aid against Li Ziking, Dorgan accepted the invitation and never left. In a twist of tragic irony, the very gates built to keep the barbarians out became the doorway through which a new dynasty entered. The Manchus marched through the Shanhai Pass, defeated Li's forces near Beijing, and claimed the mandate of heaven. The Ming dynasty, after 276 years, was no more. In its place, the Qing was born. The transition was not instant nor merciful. The South remained loyal to the fallen dynasty, forming resistance courts that clung to legitimacy like a fading ember. Princes and loyalists fled to Nanjing, then to the coastal provinces, raising banners in the name of the Ming. But their unity was fragile, their armies divided. The Manchus advanced relentlessly, offering clemency to those who submitted and annihilation to those who resisted. City after city fell. Suzhou, Hangzhou, Nanjing, each surrendered, often after terrible massacres. The dream of restoration dissolved into blood and exile. Among the loyalists, there were heroes and martyrs. The scholar official Shi Kefa, refusing to surrender, wrote his final words before execution. "I have done all that I could. Let history judge the rest." In the south, Zheng Chenggong, known to Europeans as Koxinga, turned his grief into defiance, leading a naval resistance that would later carve out a Ming stronghold in Taiwan. Even as the empire fell, its spirit refused to die. In their poetry, their letters, their whispered prayers, the last generation of Ming subjects carried a quiet sorrow that would echo through centuries, the mourning of a world that had believed itself eternal. The Qing conquest was both an ending and a beginning. The new rulers adopted Chinese institutions, Confucian ideals, and the language of legitimacy. They presented themselves not as conquerors, but as restorers of order. Yet beneath the surface, a deep scar remained. To many Han Chinese, the fall of the Ming was not merely political, it was cosmic. The mandate of heaven, the balance between ruler and ruled, had been broken. The dynasty that had rebuilt the Great Wall had fallen because its own walls, moral, spiritual, and economic, had collapsed first. And so, the Ming became legend. In art, its palaces were remembered in soft ink and mist. In theater, its heroes were immortalized as symbols of loyalty and loss. In whispers, people said that the last emperor's spirit still walked beneath the trees of Jingshan Hill, forever watching the city he could not save. For generations, the story of the Ming's fall became a mirror, a reminder of the fragility of power, the danger of arrogance, and the beauty of an empire's final breath. It is easy, centuries later, to see the fall of the Ming as inevitable, a cycle of history repeating itself. But to the people who lived through it, it was the end of the world. The forbidden city stood silent, its vermilion gates closed, the throne room empty but for the echo of lost footsteps. The dragon had fallen, but the world moved on. From the ashes of one dynasty, another rose. And yet, somewhere in the silence of that spring morning in 1644, as the last emperor swayed beneath the locust tree, one could almost hear the faintest whisper, not of defeat, but of release. The empire had not been destroyed. It had simply returned to the rhythm of eternity, where rise and fall are but the breathing of time itself. The new mandate, the Qing and the rebirth of empire. When an old world ends, there is a silence that lingers before the new one begins to breathe. In the spring of 1644, Beijing burned, and the dragon flag of the Ming fluttered into ash. But even as the smoke rose, the heavens were already shifting. Far to the northeast, beyond the passes and frozen rivers, a new people stirred, hunters and horsemen from the forests of Manchuria, heirs to a different kind of strength. They had waited for this moment patiently, like winter watching the weakening sun. And now the heavens had chosen them. The mandate, that invisible seal of divine favor, had passed quietly into their hands. The Manchus were not strangers to China's story. For decades, they had studied its rhythms, learning its language, its rituals, its ideas of heaven and order. Their leader, Narashi, had begun this long game a lifetime earlier, uniting rival tribes beneath the 8 banners, a military and social system that blended discipline with devotion. He called his new realm the later Jin, claiming descent from the Jurchens who had once founded the Jin dynasty centuries before. But Narashi's vision was larger than revenge. It was restoration, to reclaim harmony between the steppe and the Song. When he died, his son Hong Taiji refined that vision. He renamed their people Manchu and their dynasty Qing, the Pure. There was wisdom in that name. It was not the fire of conquest that defined the Qing, but clarity, a calm, strategic patience. The Manchus knew that ruling China meant more than occupying its land. It meant mastering its heart. They adopted the rituals of the Ming, preserved the bureaucracy, and swore to serve the Confucian ideal of benevolence. Their conquests were swift, but their transformation was slow and deliberate. In their courts, they read Chinese classics. In their temples, they honored both their ancestors and Confucius. They dressed in silk robes, yet beneath them, the old warrior spirit still moved, quiet, alert, unbroken. When Dorgan, the Manchu regent, entered Beijing that fateful summer, he did not burn it. He knelt at the tombs of Ming emperors and ordered them protected. He proclaimed that the Qing would rule not as destroyers, but as restorers of order. To the weary people, this mattered. They were exhausted from rebellion, famine, and fear. They no longer cared who wore the crown, only that peace would return. And so the mandate, that ancient symbol of cosmic harmony, settled on new shoulders. The Qing had arrived. Yet the conquest of a nation's body is easier than the conquest of its soul. The first years were uncertain. Across the south, loyalists of the Ming refused to yield. They raised new emperors, clung to fading banners, and vowed to fight to the death. Cities like Nanjing, Fuzhou, and Guangzhou became ghost capitals of a fallen dream. Scholars wrote poetry by candlelight, mourning the loss of virtue, weeping over the fall of the Han to barbarian hands. In the mountains and along the coast, resistance burned quietly, led by men like Zheng Chenggang, Koxinga, whose fleets ruled the seas and whose heart still belonged to the old dynasty. But time has a way of softening what fire cannot destroy. The Ming loyalists, divided by pride and distance, fell one by one. By the 1660s, the South was pacified, and the last Ming prince fled to Burma, where he met his end in exile. Zheng Chenggang, who had fled to Taiwan, created a Ming outpost across the sea, a symbol of unbroken faith. But even that dream would fade. In 1683, the island fell to Qing forces, and with it, the final echo of the Ming was gone. The Qing were now undisputed masters of China. But their victory was not built on cruelty. It was built on absorption. They understood that survival meant adaptation. Manchu princes married Chinese nobility. Scholars who had once mourned the Ming now served the new dynasty, their pens turning rebellion into remembrance. The court retained the Confucian civil service exams, rewarding merit, not birth. The emperor ruled as son of heaven, not conqueror. Slowly, the Qing ceased to be outsiders. They became the empire itself. Under the early emperors, the Qing entered what would later be called its golden age. The Kangxi emperor, who reigned from 1661 to 1722, embodied everything the new dynasty aspired to be: intelligent, disciplined, and deeply human. He was only 7 when he ascended the throne, but even as a child, his will was iron. He learned Chinese classics, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. He studied his enemies' languages and read Jesuit maps of the world. Kangxi was not merely an emperor. He was a student of civilization itself. His reign brought stability to a fractured land. He rebuilt cities, repaired the Grand Canal, and lowered taxes to heal a population broken by war. He opened dialogues with Western missionaries, fascinated by their science and machines, yet firm in defending his empire's traditions. He led campaigns against rebels and foreign powers alike, the Mongols in the north, the Dzungars in Central Asia, expanding China's borders to their greatest extent in centuries. But above all, he ruled with patience. He understood that the Qing's legitimacy rested not in fear, but in harmony. To rule a great nation, he once said, is like cooking a small fish. You must handle it gently. After him came his grandson, the Qianlong Emperor, whose reign marked the height of Qing glory. The empire stretched from the Amur to Tibet, from the deserts of Xinjiang to the jungles of Vietnam. The treasury overflowed. Art, poetry, and porcelain flourished. The Forbidden City glowed once again with ceremony and splendor. Qianlong saw himself as a philosopher king, a custodian of beauty and order. He compiled vast encyclopedias, collected paintings and books, and celebrated the harmony of all under heaven. His court became a mirror of the cosmos, balanced, radiant, absolute. And yet, beneath the perfection, small fractures began to form. The very peace that the Qing had created began to soften their edge. Wealth bred complacency. Bureaucrats grew lazy, courtiers corrupt. The empire that had once expanded through wisdom now sank into ritual. The emperor's word became law, and few dared to question it. The people prospered, but the government grew distant. And beyond China's borders, the world was changing. In the West, Europe was awakening to a new kind of power, one born of machines, science, and empire. Ships larger than temples crossed the seas, carrying not just trade, but ambition. The Qing, proud of their self-sufficiency, saw little reason to engage. When British envoys came bearing gifts and requests for open trade, Qianlong dismissed them with polite indifference. "We possess all things," he wrote to King George III. "I set no value on strange objects." It was not arrogance, but conviction, the belief that China was still the center of the world. But history had already begun to turn. For now, though, in the 18th century, the empire still shimmered like a dream. Rice fields rippled under the sun, scholars recited poetry in tranquil gardens, and the Great Wall stretched silent under the northern stars. In these centuries of peace, the Qing became more Chinese than the Chinese themselves, the guardians of a civilization that had endured for millennia. The mandate of heaven, once a fragile flame, burned steady once more. But the heavens, as always, do not favor one house forever. The story of the Qing would one day turn toward opium and iron, rebellion and revolution, the twilight of dynasties. Yet, in the quiet heart of their reign, the Manchus achieved what few conquerors ever have. They became what they had conquered. They rebuilt an empire not with destruction, but with discipline, not with cruelty, but with understanding. And so the new dynasty stood, serene and immense, like a mountain reflected in still water. Beneath its calm surface, time flowed unseen, the eternal rhythm of rise and fall, creation and decay. The banners fluttered in the northern wind, the drums of the court beat softly in the distance, and the empire, vast, ordered, luminous, dreamed on beneath the wide and silent sky. The shadows of the West, opium, trade, and the beginning of decline. There are moments in history when the horizon changes, not with thunder or flame, but with the slow, creeping light of something unfamiliar. The Qing Empire, in the late 18th century, still believed itself to be eternal. From the icy frontiers of Manchuria to the warm waters of Canton, everything within its borders moved to rhythms centuries old. Ritual, poetry, and balance, these were the pillars upon which the empire rested. To the emperors who ruled from the Forbidden City, the world beyond China's mountains and seas seemed distant, perhaps even irrelevant. Yet far across those same seas, in the dark smoke of factories and the roar of new machines, another world was awakening. Europe had changed. The Age of Enlightenment had given birth to the Age of Industry. Empires once bound by wind and oar now traveled by steam. The ships that left the ports of London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon no longer carried spices or silks as rare luxuries. They carried power. The British Empire, in particular, had grown vast and hungry. It stretched across oceans, feeding on trade, coal, and conquest. To fuel its economy, Britain needed new markets and new materials, and for that it looked east. For centuries, China had been the heart of global desire. Tea, silk, and porcelain flowed outward like rivers of gold, enriching the Middle Kingdom and mesmerizing the West. The British, however, had little that China wanted. The Qianlong Emperor's famous letter to King George III had been clear. China was self-sufficient, and foreign goods were unnecessary. "We possess all things," he wrote, in tones both serene and final. But this balance of trade was unsustainable for Britain. Silver, the currency of international trade, was flowing out of London and into Canton in staggering quantities. To restore the balance, the British sought a commodity that the Chinese would buy in return. What they found was poison, opium. At first, it was a medicine, a cure for pain and sleeplessness, used in moderation. But like all powerful things, its strength became its danger. The British East India Company, through its holdings in India, began to cultivate vast fields of opium poppies. The sticky resin, when dried and smoked, brought euphoria, escape, and dependence. Smuggled into China through private traders, opium became both a vice and a weapon. By the early 1800s, millions of Chinese were addicted. Soldiers, farmers, merchants, even scholars succumbed to its haze. The empire's veins, once strong with discipline, began to weaken. The irony was tragic. The Qing rulers, heirs to centuries of moral philosophy, had built their legitimacy on the idea of order, the harmony between heaven, earth, and man. Yet here was a threat that eroded that order from within. The opium trade drained silver from the treasury, corrupted officials, and undermined the very heart of Confucian virtue. The Emperor Daoguang saw the danger and sought to act. In 1839, he appointed a man named Lin Zexu, a scholar of rare courage and moral clarity, to end the scourge once and for all. Lin Zexu's mission would become legendary. He arrived in Canton like a storm, disciplined, incorruptible, resolute. He ordered the destruction of all opium stocks and demanded that British traders cease their illegal smuggling immediately. When they refused, he seized and publicly burned over 20,000 chests of opium, an act both moral and defiant. In his famous letter to Queen Victoria, he appealed not to profit but to conscience. If you forbid opium at home, why send it abroad to poison another people? His words carried truth, but truth alone does not stop empire. The British response was swift and merciless. The First Opium War began that same year. Against China's wooden junks and outdated cannon stood Britain's modern steam-powered warships, the iron beasts of the new age. In the battles that followed, the outcome was never in doubt. Coastal forts crumbled, fleets burned, and cities fell. The Qing soldiers fought bravely, but courage was no match for technology. The war was not just a clash of armies. It was a collision of centuries. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanking ended the war, and with it, China's illusion of isolation. The terms were humiliating. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain. 5 major ports were opened to foreign trade. Heavy reparations were demanded. The Middle Kingdom, which had once viewed itself as the center of civilization, was now forced to treat Western powers as equals, or worse, as masters. It was the beginning of what Chinese historians would later call the century of humiliation. But humiliation alone does not capture the depth of what happened. The Opium War was more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual fracture. For centuries, the Chinese worldview had been built on harmony, the belief that heaven's order governed all things. Now that order seemed to have broken. The world had changed, but China had not changed with it. The mandate of heaven, that invisible bond between ruler and ruled, began to tremble. In the years that followed, foreign powers pressed deeper into China's heart. New treaties followed, each more punishing than the last. Britain, France, Russia, and later even the United States demanded most favored nation status, extraterritorial rights, and free trade in opium. Missionaries spread Christianity, while merchants spread Western goods and influence. To the common people, it felt as if the sky itself was collapsing. And beneath that collapsing sky, something else began to stir anger. The people's faith in the Qing court, already shaken by corruption and defeat, began to crumble. In the south, whispers of rebellion grew louder. Peasants, hungry and desperate, turned to new visions of salvation. One of those visions came from a failed scholar named Hung Shuquan, a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. His movement, the Taiping Rebellion, would soon engulf half the empire in one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history. But before that fire spread, there was still a quiet moment, the brief, uncertain calm between storms. In Beijing, the Daoguang Emperor sat within the crimson halls of the Forbidden City, surrounded by ministers who spoke in measured tones but trembled inside. Outside, the world had changed forever. Steamships now sailed up China's rivers. Foreign soldiers walked its streets. Western maps began to redraw the East. The empire that had once thought itself eternal now stood at the edge of a new and unforgiving age. Yet, even in defeat, the spirit of China did not die. It withdrew, waiting, remembering. The same resilience that had carried it through invasions, dynastic falls, and centuries of change now smoldered quietly in its people. They did not yet know how to fight this new kind of war, a war of industry, trade, and ideas, but the seed of awakening had been planted. History would remember the Opium War as a tragedy, but perhaps it was also a reckoning, a mirror held up to an ancient civilization, forcing it to see the world not as it was, but as it had become. The balance of heaven and earth had shifted, and the Middle Kingdom would never be the same again. In the shadows of the West, under the cold glow of iron and steam, the Qing dynasty faced a truth older than empire itself, that power, like time, flows ever forward. And as the dragon slept, the world moved on, waiting for the next dawn, the next storm, the next rebirth. The age of rebellion, Taiping, Nayan, and the shattering of the mandate, it began not with armies, but with dreams. Dreams of salvation, of revenge, of a world turned right again after centuries of corruption and despair. By the middle of the 19th century, China was a nation haunted by defeat. The opium that once seeped quietly through its veins had now become a metaphor for something larger, the slow decay of a civilization that had forgotten how to wake. The Qing court, shaken by its humiliation at the hands of the British, was still reeling. The emperor sat in silence within the crimson halls of the Forbidden City, surrounded by ritual and ceremony that no longer matched the chaos outside its walls. The countryside, however, did not share in this stillness. There, something wild and desperate was stirring. The land itself seemed to groan under the weight of misery. Floods, droughts, and famine had become more frequent. Taxes grew heavier as officials tried to rebuild a treasury drained by war reparations. Local corruption, that timeless plague of dynasties, spread like fire. Villagers, once bound by Confucian ideals of loyalty and order, began to lose faith in heaven's design. For centuries, rebellion had been the language of the forgotten, the storm that followed neglect. But this rebellion, when it came, would be unlike any China had ever seen. In the hills of Guangxi province, a failed scholar named Hong Xiuquan wandered through sickness and vision. He had taken the imperial exams several times and failed, a humiliation that cut deep in a culture that worshipped education as the path to virtue and success. But Hong's failure was only the beginning of something far stranger. In fever dreams, he claimed to have ascended to heaven, where he met a radiant elder who called him younger brother. That elder, he said, was none other than Jesus Christ. When Hong awoke, he believed himself chosen, destined to cleanse China of demons, corruption, and sin. Hong's vision fused elements of Christianity, Confucian ethics, and his own burning resentment into something new, a religion of rebellion. He called his followers the God worshippers, and they spread with frightening speed among the impoverished and the desperate. His message was simple but electrifying. The Qing were demons, the empire was corrupt, and heaven demanded renewal. By 1850, the spark had become a blaze. The Taiping Rebellion began as a whisper of faith and grew into an apocalypse. The rebels declared the creation of the heavenly kingdom of great peace, Taiping Tianguo, and Hong Xiuquan crowned himself the heavenly king. What followed was not merely a revolt, but a revolution, one that sought to destroy the old world entirely. The Taiping banned opium, alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. They outlawed foot-binding and proclaimed equality between men and women. Land was to be shared, wealth redistributed, and the Confucian order overturned. At first, their message found fertile ground. The countryside, long neglected by Qing officials, turned to the Taiping for hope. By 1853, their armies, disciplined, fanatical, and vast, had captured Nanjing, renaming it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. From there, they ruled with a mix of divine fervor and brutal control. Yet within their dream of peace, there was fire. The heavenly kingdom's leaders, though united in vision, were divided by pride. Hong Xiuquan withdrew from active governance, retreating into spiritual isolation. His lieutenants fought among themselves for power. Behind their utopian decrees lay paranoia and bloodshed. The same zeal that had inspired them to rise began to consume them from within. The Qing court, at first paralyzed by fear, slowly began to recover. They realized that if they did not act, the dynasty would end. In the provinces, new leaders rose, pragmatic, determined, and loyal to the old order, but aware of the need for reform. Among them were men like Zheng, Gofan, Zhuo Zongtang, and Li Hongzhang. Confucian scholars turned generals who would rebuild the empire's strength from the ground up. Zheng Gofan, in particular, saw the rebellion not merely as a political crisis, but as a moral one. To him, the fall of order was the result of inner decay, and only virtue, discipline, and unity could restore the mandate of heaven. He raised local militias, trained them with rigorous Confucian principles, and turned them into a formidable fighting force known as the Xiang Army. Their loyalty was not to the court in Beijing, but to their leader and to the ideal of restoring harmony to the empire. The war that followed was catastrophic. For over a decade, from 1850 to 1864, China bled. The Taiping Rebellion became one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Tens of millions perished through battle, famine, and disease. Cities were razed, farmlands turned to wastelands, and entire provinces emptied of life. The once glorious Yangtze River, cradle of Chinese civilization, now carried corpses downstream. Amid the chaos, other fires ignited. In northern China, the Nyan Rebellion broke out, a movement born of banditry and desperation. The Nyan were not religious idealists like the Taiping. They were survivors, peasants turned warriors, who fought out of hunger and fury. They raided towns, attacked officials, and carved out territories of defiance across the plains. To the Qing, it seemed as if the empire itself had shattered into 1,000 fragments of rebellion. Foreign powers, meanwhile, watched with quiet satisfaction. Britain and France, already enriched by their earlier victories, saw opportunity in China's weakness. When their commercial interests were threatened, they struck again, launching the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860. Once more, the Qing were forced into humiliating treaties. Beijing was burned, the emperor fled, and the Western powers secured even greater privileges. And yet, somehow, amid the ruin, the Qing endured. Zheng Gophan's forces slowly encircled Nanjing. His soldiers, hardened by years of relentless campaigning, advanced with grim determination. In 1864, the Xiang army breached the city walls. What followed was a slaughter so vast that even Zheng himself wept at its aftermath. Hong Xiuquan was dead, said to have taken poison before capture, and with him died the heavenly kingdom of great peace. But victory brought no peace. The empire that emerged from the rebellion was changed forever. The old illusions of eternal stability were gone. The Qing had survived, but only barely, and only through the rise of regional armies that now held real power. The emperor remained a figure of ritual and continuity, but the true strength of the dynasty now lay in men like Zheng and Li, provincial leaders whose loyalty to the throne was pragmatic, not spiritual. The land was scarred beyond measure. Villages lay in ruins, families scattered, the economy crippled. Yet beneath the ashes, new seeds were beginning to take root. For the first time, Chinese officials and scholars began to look outward, to study Western technology, military methods, and political systems. The era that followed, known as the self-strengthening movement, would attempt to fuse China's ancient soul with the tools of modernity. It was a fragile hope, born of devastation. A typing dream had failed, but its echo lingered. It had shown that faith, once awakened, could move millions, but also that vision without unity could destroy a nation. The Nyan's defiance had proven that desperation could challenge empires, but that chaos could never sustain one. And the Qing, though triumphant, had learned the bitter lesson of survival, that victory purchased with the blood of millions is only the shadow of defeat. By the late 1860s, China stood amid the ruins of its own past, staring uncertainly toward a future it could not yet comprehend. The dragon still breathed, but its fire had dimmed. The mandate of heaven, that mystical seal of legitimacy that had guided dynasties for millennia, now flickered in the wind. Somewhere, in the silent halls of the Forbidden City, an emperor prayed for peace. Outside, the people whispered prayers of their own, not to heaven, but to the memory of a time when the world still made sense. The age of rebellion had ended, but its wounds would shape China's destiny for generations. And in that long silence after the storm, one question remained. How does a civilization rebuild itself after it has seen the heart of its own destruction? The Forbidden City, the heart of heaven and earth. There are places in the world where time seems to stop, where every breath feels older than the stones beneath your feet. The Forbidden City is one such place. Rising from the dust of the Ming Dynasty's ambition, it was more than a palace. It was a universe built in perfect order, a mirror of heaven itself. To step through its crimson gates was to leave the mortal world behind and enter a realm ruled by celestial law. Yet behind that divine stillness, behind the golden rooftops and marble courtyards, beat the fragile heart of a very human empire. The idea for the Forbidden City was born from a single powerful vision, that the emperor was the son of heaven, chosen to rule not merely a kingdom, but the cosmic balance of all things. When Yongle, the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty, seized power after a bloody civil war, he knew that legitimacy required more than victory. He needed a symbol, something so magnificent it would silence all doubts and awe the world into obedience. So he turned to Beijing, the city of the north, a place steeped in frontier memories and imperial ghosts, and declared that it would become the new capital of China. The construction began in 1406, a monumental endeavor that would take 14 years, hundreds of thousands of laborers, and nearly every resource the empire could command. The design was not arbitrary. Every wall, every gate, every courtyard was built according to strict cosmological principles. The layout of the universe itself reflected in architecture. The central axis represented the connection between heaven and earth. The main halls aligned perfectly with celestial north, while the color scheme followed the logic of the 5 elements: yellow for earth, red for fire, and black for water, binding philosophy, religion, and power into a single vision. At the heart of the complex stood the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the Emperor's throne room, the very center of the universe, as the Ming saw it. Here, beneath vast golden beams carved with dragons and clouds, the Emperor would sit upon a dais of red lacquer and jade. His presence was considered divine. His words, the echoes of heaven's will. The courtiers who approached him did so, with their eyes lowered, careful not to breathe too loudly, as if afraid that a single misplaced motion might disturb the cosmic order itself. It was not merely reverence, it was ritual, a performance of divinity that reinforced the illusion of perfection. Outside the palace walls, the city of Beijing transformed. Streets radiated outward like ripples from a stone cast into water. The outer city grew crowded with merchants, artisans, and soldiers, all living in the emperor's shadow. Temples, gardens, and administrative offices filled the capital until it became a living organism. An empire contained within walls, pulsing with both grandeur and control. But the deeper you went into the Forbidden City, the quieter it became. The noise of the world faded, replaced by still courtyards and corridors that seemed to hum with invisible tension. The silence was not peaceful, it was ceremonial. Every sound that dared to break it carried the weight of history. Life inside the palace was both sacred and suffocating. The emperor was at the center, yet utterly alone. He ruled over millions, yet trusted no one completely. His court was a labyrinth of hierarchy and intrigue. Eunuchs, the silent administrators of palace life, wielded enormous power behind the scenes. Scholars, advisors, and concubines competed for influence, each move carefully calculated within the delicate dance of imperial politics. The palace, for all its order, was a living chessboard. Every gesture, every whisper, a potential turning point in the fate of the dynasty. Yet the Forbidden City was not merely a prison of politics. It was also a canvas of art and philosophy. Painters, poets, architects, and philosophers all contributed to its creation. Its decorations carried meanings layered like time itself. Dragons symbolizing strength, cranes representing longevity, and phoenixes embodying rebirth. In the emperor's private chambers, the ceilings were painted with swirling constellations, a reminder that he was both master of earth and servant of the stars. The palace was not just a home, it was a cosmos made visible. But beneath the layers of beauty lay an unspoken truth, that even divinity could decay. The same perfection that made the Forbidden City magnificent also made it fragile. Its order depended on constant control, and control is always temporary. The emperors who followed Yongle inherited his masterpiece, but struggled to live up to its expectations. They were trapped in rituals so rigid they could scarcely breathe outside them. A ruler's strength was measured not in compassion or vision, but in how flawlessly he could maintain the illusion of heavenly harmony. In time, that illusion began to crack. Outside the palace, the world was changing. Beyond the wall, the steppe tribes regrouped, trading horses for gunpowder and old grudges for new ambitions. To the south, foreign ships began to appear on the horizon, strange vessels with iron hulls and white sails that gleamed like ghosts. The world beyond China was expanding, restless, and unpredictable. Yet inside the Forbidden City, the empire clung to the belief that the world would forever orbit around its throne. This was not arrogance. It was faith, a faith built into every brick and stone. But faith, too, can erode. And yet, in its prime, the Forbidden City was not merely the seat of power. It was a dream realized. It represented everything the Ming Dynasty aspired to be: orderly, radiant, eternal. It was a promise to the heavens and to the ancestors that China had reclaimed its rightful place after centuries of chaos. Every festival, every audience, every ritual reaffirmed that promise. When the emperor walked through the hall of supreme harmony, his dragon robe shimmering in the light of dawn, he was not just a man. He was the axis upon which the universe turned. The people believed it, and for a time, perhaps even he did too. But history is rarely kind to perfection. The grandeur that once inspired awe began to breed complacency. The imperial bureaucracy grew heavy with formality. The eunuchs, once servants, became power brokers. The emperor, isolated by protocol, became a figure of ceremony rather than a man of action. The Forbidden City, once the heart of the empire, began to turn inward, its silence deepening into stagnation. What had once been the symbol of eternal order slowly became the echo chamber of a fading dynasty. Still, there is something haunting about the way the light falls across its courtyards today. The red walls glow softly at sunset. The golden roofs catch the last rays of the sun and scatter them like fragments of memory. The sound of footsteps on ancient stone seems to carry voices long gone, ministers debating, poets reciting, emperors dreaming. The air itself feels heavy with the weight of stories untold. The Forbidden City endures not because it remains untouched, but because it remains remembered. To walk its corridors now is to step through centuries of human ambition, a place where divinity met mortality, where perfection was built and broken, and where the empire's heart still beats faintly beneath layers of silence. The Forbidden City was, and still is, a paradox, a fortress of beauty that both protected and suffocated its masters, a world designed to mirror heaven that could not escape the flaws of earth. It stands today as a monument to both greatness and fragility. Its walls remind us that power, no matter how divine it claims to be, is always human. Its silence speaks not of peace, but of the delicate tension that held an empire together. And as the modern world hums beyond its gates, the Forbidden City remains still, waiting, watching, remembering, the last echo of a dynasty that once believed it could bridge heaven and earth.
The Emperor's Voyages. When China touched the edge of the world, it's hard to imagine, as we look at a map today, that there was once a time when China looked out at the ocean and saw not a boundary, but a beginning. In the early 15th century, while Europe still hesitated at the edges of its known world, China set its sails across oceans unknown. This was the age of the Great Ming Voyages, a chapter so vast, so audacious, that it almost feels like myth, led by a man whose name carried both reverence and wonder. Zheng He. These voyages would transform China's sense of self, expand its reach across continents, and remind the world that this dynasty, newly reborn from the ashes of Mongol rule, had the power to touch the very edges of the earth. It began with a vision, the vision of Emperor Yongle having secured his throne through struggle and blood. Yongle sought to project his legitimacy not only within his empire but across the known world. He believed that heaven's mandate extended beyond China's mountains and rivers, that the seas themselves bowed to his divine authority. Yet his ambition was not conquest in the European sense. It was a quest for recognition, a reaffirmation of the cosmic order. If China was the center of civilization, then the world must be reminded of that truth. And so, in 1405, the docks of Nanjing thundered with life as the first of the great treasure fleets took shape. These ships were unlike anything the world had seen. The largest of them, the treasure ships, were said to be nearly 400 feet long, towering over the ocean like floating palaces. They carried porcelain, silk, spices, gold, and gifts from the heart of China, offerings of goodwill and symbols of power. Thousands of sailors, soldiers, scholars, and translators filled the decks, their journeys mapped not just across seas, but across cultures. At the fleet's command stood Admiral Zheng He, a man whose life was itself a story of transformation. Born in Yunnan to a Muslim family, captured as a boy, castrated, and sent into imperial service. He rose through intelligence, loyalty, and sheer presence to become one of the emperor's most trusted men. To the Ming court, Zhang, he represented something almost mythic, a man who had transcended suffering to serve heaven's will. When the great sails unfurled for the first voyage, the sight must have been breathtaking. Wooden masts creaked against the wind, banners snapped in the air, and the fleet, hundreds of ships strong, began to move like an island come to life. As they left the mouth of the Yangtze River, the world seemed to open before them. They sailed through the South China Sea, crossed the Indian Ocean, and reached lands most Chinese had only heard of in legends, the kingdoms of Java, Ceylon, Calicut, and Arabia. Everywhere they went, they brought gifts and received them in return. They carried the message of the Ming Emperor that China had risen once more, powerful, prosperous, and benevolent. But these were not voyages of conquest or colonization. They were performances of presence, demonstrations of cosmic harmony on a global stage. When Zheng He's fleets arrived in foreign ports, they did not plant flags. They built relationships. Rulers were invited, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly, to acknowledge the emperor's supremacy, to enter the Ming tribute system that bound distant lands to the empire through ritual and exchange. To the Ming, the world was not a competition of empires. It was a hierarchy, with China at its sacred center and all others orbiting it like stars around the moon. In places like Malacca, the Ming fleets established order and stability, protecting trade routes from pirates and fostering alliances that would endure for generations. In Arabia and Africa, they exchanged silk for ivory, porcelain for gold, and stories for wonder. When Zheng He reached the Swahili coast, his ships towered above the palm trees, gleaming in the sun. The locals watched in awe as emissaries in embroidered robes descended from ships larger than any they had seen before. Gifts were exchanged: giraffes, exotic woods, and spices, symbols of friendship between worlds that had never touched before. It was diplomacy written upon the waves. Yet, behind the grandeur, there was always a question lingering in the shadows. Why? Why did China, so self-sufficient, so confident in its centrality, need to reach out to the world at all? Some saw these voyages as expressions of the emperor's boundless ambition, others as acts of faith, reaffirming heaven's order on earth. For a time, the answer didn't matter. The fleets returned home laden with treasures, maps, and stories that enriched the Ming imagination. China had proven that it could reach the edge of the world, and the world had bowed in acknowledgement. But then, just as suddenly as they began, the voyages stopped. The reasons were many: political, economic, philosophical. After Yongel's death, the court turned inward. Confucian scholars, long suspicious of the extravagance of maritime adventures, argued that true virtue lay in cultivating the heartland, not chasing distant horizons. The vast expense of maintaining the fleets drained the treasury. The eunuchs who had championed the voyages lost power. And so, in a quiet, almost tragic reversal, the greatest navy the world had ever known was dismantled. The shipyards fell silent. The records of the voyages were archived, and many later destroyed. China, which had once touched the world's edge, turned its gaze inward once more. For centuries, the sea became a forgotten dream. The harbors that had once launched great fleets were left to fishermen and traders. The memory of Zhang He faded into legend, a whisper of a time when the empire's vision stretched beyond the horizon. And yet, those who remembered knew that for a brief, dazzling moment, China had not merely looked at the sea, it had commanded it. The story of Zhang He and his voyages is more than an account of ships and trade routes. It's a reflection of a civilization's confidence and contradiction. It shows us the height of Ming power when China could project its image across oceans, and also the fragility of that power. When fear and conservatism pulled it back from the world it had begun to explore. The sea, for the Ming, was both promise and peril, a symbol of glory and a mirror of anxiety. They touched it, mastered it, and then retreated from it, as if afraid of what it revealed about themselves. And yet, in that retreat lies one of history's most poignant what-ifs. What if the Ming had continued to sail westward? What if, decades before Columbus, the Chinese fleets had crossed beyond Africa and reached the Atlantic? How different might the story of the world have been? These are questions that linger like salt in the air, tantalizing, unanswerable, eternal. Today, when we look at models of Zhang He's ships or paintings of the great treasure fleets, we can almost hear the whisper of their sails, the creak of wood, against water, the rhythm of drums that once guided them across the ocean. The spirit of exploration that drove those voyages was not born of greed or conquest. It was born of curiosity, of wonder, of an empire reaching out to the world not to take, but to know. And though the Ming would later seal its borders and fortify its land, the memory of those voyages remains a reminder that even the most inward civilizations have moments when they look outward, when they dream beyond. Their walls when they dare to face the edge of the world. The emperor's fleets may be gone, their ships lost to time, but their wake still glimmers faintly across history. A trace of starlight on the water leading back to a time when China's heart beat in rhythm with the sea.
The turning inward. Walls of stone, walls of mind. There is a moment in every great civilization when the horizon narrows, not because the world has shrunk, but because the mind has chosen to retreat. After the thunderous age of the Ming treasure fleets, after the sails of Zheng He vanished into silence, China began to turn inward. The dynasty that once touched the edges of the world started to build walls, not just of brick and earth, but of thought and fear. What had once been an empire defined by openness and ambition slowly became one defined by caution and preservation. And yet, even in that turning inward, there was a quiet grandeur, a belief that within its borders lay all that heaven and earth could offer. The early 15th century had shown the Ming dynasty at its most outward reaching. But by the mid-15th and 16th centuries, something fundamental had changed. The oceans that had once carried symbols of imperial pride were now seen as thresholds of danger. Pirates haunted the coasts. Smugglers, merchants, and foreign envoys brought goods that dazzled and ideas that unsettled. The court officials, steeped in Confucian ideals, began to argue that China's true strength did not lie across the seas, but in the soil of its own heartland. And so the empire began to draw lines, firm, immovable, defensive. The Great Wall, that eternal symbol of Chinese endurance, began to rise once more, stone by stone, across the northern frontier. But the wall was not just a fortification. It was a philosophy made visible. It told the world, and reminded China itself, that stability was worth more than adventure, that harmony was safer than change. And perhaps in that time, such caution felt necessary. Nomadic tribes still pressed against the borders. Court intrigues simmered within the forbidden city. Corruption crept through the bureaucracy. The empire's scholars warned that foreign luxuries would erode moral order, that openness would invite chaos. The emperor, wrapped in silk and ritual, listened, and the walls grew higher. Yet, while the wall was built of stone, the deeper fortifications were invisible. They rose in the minds of men, in the cautious scripts of bureaucrats, in the measured tones of scholars, in the rituals that governed every breath of imperial life. The Ming worldview became a mirror reflecting itself. The empire saw perfection in its own image, and sought only to preserve it. To many, the idea of seeking new knowledge from beyond its borders felt unnecessary, even dangerous. Why search the world when you believed the world already revolved around you? Still, outside those walls, the world was changing. Across the oceans, the sails of Europe began to rise. Tiny kingdoms, Portugal, Spain, later England, and the Netherlands, began to chart courses into the unknown. They carried with them not only greed, but curiosity, courage, and the strange, unyielding desire to expand. As China closed its ports, Europe opened its harbors. As the Ming court suppressed maritime trade, Europeans built global empires. It was a quiet divergence, two halves of the old world moving in opposite directions. And in that slow divergence, history's balance began to tilt. Inside China, the Ming still flourished, outwardly. Cities like Beijing, Nanjing, and Suzhou pulsed with art, architecture, and literature. The imperial palaces glowed with lacquer and gold. The scholars compiled encyclopedias and histories of breathtaking scope. But beneath this brilliance lay fragility. The cost of maintaining stability grew ever heavier. The bureaucracy swelled, the peasantry strained, the military weakened. The emperor became more distant, often hidden behind screens and ministers. To rule the Middle Kingdom was no longer to conquer or build, it was to preserve. And preservation, though noble, has its limits. The Great Wall stretched for thousands of miles, snaking through deserts and mountains, each stone laid by hands that believed they were securing eternity. The northern winds howled against its ramparts, and the watchtowers stood like silent sentinels. Yet the irony was cruel. For all its strength, the wall could never truly keep the world out. It could delay invasion, but not prevent it. It could define a border, but not protect a dynasty from decay within. The real enemy was not at the gate. It was in the court, in the complacency of minds that mistook stillness for strength. And yet, even in this turning inward, beauty endured. The Ming era saw a flowering of art and culture that remains unmatched. Porcelain workshops in Jingdezhen perfected the ethereal blue and white ceramics that became symbols of timeless grace. Painters captured the tranquil perfection of mountains shrouded in mist. Writers explored the depths of human feeling in stories like The Plum in the Golden Vase and Journey to the West. Even as the empire looked inward, its imagination stretched outward, across landscapes, across souls. Perhaps that is one of history's most profound contradictions. Even when empires retreat, creativity continues to wander. But outside, the tide of the world was shifting. The Portuguese arrived in Asia in the early 1500s, their caravels cutting through seas once ruled by Zhenghi's fleets. When they reached China's southern shores, they were not met with imperial grandeur, but suspicion. Trade was permitted only under strict control, and foreigners were confined to small enclaves. The Ming court viewed these visitors as barbarians, their ships as curiosities, rather than harbingers of a new age. It did not yet realize that those sails carried the future, a future that would one day knock insistently upon China's closed gates. As decades passed, the Ming's inward focus deepened. The imperial examinations, once symbols of merit and intellect, became instruments of rigidity, favoring memorization over innovation. The economy strained under the weight of corruption. Famines, rebellions, and border pressures began to fracture the illusion of permanence. The Great Wall, though vast, could not protect against the invisible forces of change. Economic exhaustion, ideological stagnation, the slow erosion of purpose. And yet, to call this era one of decline would be too simple, too cruel. For within those walls, the Ming still embodied something extraordinary, a deep serenity, a belief in balance and order that has rarely been matched. While Europe tore itself apart with wars and empires, China cultivated a vision of stability that endured for centuries. It was not expansion that defined the Ming soul. It was endurance. The dynasty's greatness lay not in its ambition, but in its ability to hold civilization together, to preserve the rhythm of life through storm and drought, through plenty and want. But time is merciless. The more the empire tried to seal itself against change, the more pressure built beneath its surface. The peasants bore the weight of taxes and labor demands. The military, once proud, grew complacent. Corruption festered. And then came the enemies the wall could not stop. The Manchus, rising in the north, their eyes fixed upon the empire that once called itself eternal. The Ming had turned its gaze inward for too long. When it finally looked outward again, it was not toward the ocean, but toward the approaching storm. And so, as we move closer to the twilight of the dynasty, we see a paradox unfold. The walls that were meant to protect China became symbols of its isolation. The ideals that once guided it toward unity became cages of conformity. And yet, in its final centuries, even as shadows grew long, the Ming remained magnificent, a civilization so complete within itself that it almost defied the need for the world. It was, perhaps, both its greatest triumph and its quietest tragedy. The fall of the Dragon Throne. Shadows over the Forbidden City. Every dynasty in China's long and turbulent history has a moment when the light begins to fade. It doesn't happen all at once. No empire simply collapses overnight. The end begins quietly, like the faint crack of ice before the thaw, like a whisper carried through corridors where no one dares to speak aloud. For the Ming Dynasty, that whisper started in the shadows of its own palace in the Forbidden City, where the emperor's will had once commanded the known world, but where, by the 1600s, fear, exhaustion, and decay had begun to take root. Beijing still glittered with imperial pride. The vermilion walls and golden roofs of the Forbidden City glowed beneath the pale northern sun. The rituals continued, the ceremonies, the processions, the imperial edicts inscribed on silk. But beneath that polished surface, something vital had begun to unravel. The empire that had rebuilt itself from the ashes of Mongol domination, that had sent fleets across oceans, that had risen to unparalleled grandeur, was now struggling to breathe under the weight of its own greatness. The dragon throne, once the symbol of divine order, had become a seat of impossible expectations. The Ming emperors of the late dynasty were heirs to both glory and burden. They had inherited a system so vast, so intricate, that it could no longer move freely. Every decision required layers of consultation. Every reform met resistance. The civil service, once the pride of Confucian governance, was now entangled in corruption and personal ambition. Scholars memorized the classics not to enlighten the state, but to secure their positions within it. Bureaucrats, terrified of punishment, learned to obey rather than to innovate. The emperor, trapped in ritual, could see little beyond the palace walls. The empire that had once looked confidently toward the world now struggled even to look inward with honesty. Outside those walls, the land trembled. Famine swept through the countryside. The climate shifted, colder winters, shorter harvests, what some historians would later call the Little Ice Age. The Yellow River flooded, the Grand Canal silted up. Crops failed, prices rose, and peasants starved. Rebellions flickered like brush fires across the provinces. Desperate men taking up arms against an empire too distant, too slow to respond. Bandit leaders, rebels, and rogue generals carved out territories of their own, promising justice in the name of heaven. The old mandate, that sacred contract between heaven and ruler, began to fray. In the heart of the palace, emperors withdrew from the world. The Wanli Emperor, who reigned for nearly half a century, spent the last decades of his life refusing to attend court meetings. His silence echoed through the empire. Ministers argued, factions formed, and policies ground to a halt. The dynasty was a ship adrift, still beautiful, still immense, but without a helmsman. And as the empire's outer provinces grew restless, foreign powers, too, began to test its edges. The Japanese invaded Korea, dragging China into a costly war that drained its coffers. The Manchus, a rising power to the northeast, watched, waited, and learned. In the streets of Beijing, the contrast between grandeur and despair became unbearable. The palaces gleamed with wealth. The people outside begged for rice. The Confucian order that had promised harmony between ruler and subject seemed hollow now, an illusion sustained by ceremony. The eunuchs, once servants of the throne, now held power far beyond their station. Many were ruthless, others cunning, but all operated in the shadows, pulling invisible strings. They became symbols of corruption, though in truth, they were only the reflection of a system collapsing under its own contradictions. And yet, even as the empire faltered, its spirit refused to die quietly. In the countryside, scholars wrote of moral renewal, of restoring virtue to the heart of governance. Soldiers fought to protect the frontiers, believing still in the dream of the Middle Kingdom. Artists, poets, and philosophers captured the melancholy of their age, the sense of watching a vast civilization crumble, not with an explosion, but with a sigh. The Ming collapse was not a tragedy of defeat in battle. It was a tragedy of exhaustion. The empire had simply grown too heavy for the hands that held it. Then came Li Ziking, a name that still stirs unease in the annals of Chinese history. A commoner, once a postal worker, driven to rebellion by hunger and injustice. He gathered the desperate and the forgotten, promising bread and fairness. His words spread like wildfire through the suffering countryside. Town after town opened its gates to him. The Ming armies, unpaid and demoralized, melted away before his advance. By 1644, his forces marched on Beijing, the heart of the dragon. Inside the Forbidden City, panic reigned. The Chongzhen Emperor, last of the Ming, was young, intelligent, and earnest, but overwhelmed. He had inherited a broken machine and had neither the allies nor the strength to repair it. As Li Zikeng's troops closed in, the emperor climbed the hill behind the palace, Coal Hill, now called Jingshan, and looked down upon the city his ancestors had built. The temples, the gates, the walls, all of it had once symbolized eternity. Now smoke rose from its edges. Realizing all was lost, he took his own life beneath a solitary tree. In that moment, 4 centuries of Ming rule ended, not with the roar of battle, but with the silence of despair. Yet the story did not end there. Li Zikeng's triumph was brief. Within months, his rebel army was driven out of Beijing, not by the Ming, but by the Manchus, who swept down from the north. They entered the city, accepted the surrender of the officials, and declared the dawn of a new dynasty, the Qing. The dragon throne had a new master. The mandate of heaven, that eternal and unyielding cycle of rise and fall, had turned once again. China would now face the world not as the Ming, the builders of walls and treasures, but as the Qing, the dynasty of horsemen and scholars, of expansion and eventual confrontation with a globalizing world. As the dust settled over the Forbidden City, a strange stillness fell. The golden roofs glowed as they always had. The courtyards echoed with footsteps as before. But something indefinable had changed. The air carried the weight of memory, the feeling of an age closing its eyes. The Ming had fallen, but its spirit lingered, in its art, in its architecture, in the minds of those who still dreamed of what China had once been. The dynasty that rebuilt the empire after foreign rule had itself fallen to outsiders, completing the great circle of history. The lesson was timeless and cruel, that even the mightiest walls cannot protect a civilization from the slow erosion of its own soul. And yet, as history would prove again and again, the Chinese world never truly ended. It transformed. The phoenix that had risen from Mongol ashes would rise once more from its own. The dynasties changed, the emperors changed, but the essence, the idea of civilization itself, endured. Perhaps that is the true secret of China's story. Not immortality, but renewal. Every fall becomes a seed. Every ruin a foundation. The rise of the Qing. Reimagining empire at the world's edge. When an empire dies, the air itself remembers. In the spring of 1644, Beijing was wrapped in silence. The smoke from Li Zikeng's fires had barely drifted away before new banners appeared above the city walls. Silken flags of pale yellow, embroidered with dragons unfamiliar to the old court. The Manchus had arrived. They rode through the gates of the fallen capital not as destroyers, but as inheritors of a world older and grander than their own. In that quiet, uncertain hour, the Middle Kingdom was reborn beneath a foreign crown. The Qing dynasty began not with celebration, but with caution. They knew they were walking upon sacred ground, a civilization so ancient that even conquerors trembled before its ghosts. The Manchus, once horsemen from the northern forests, had watched the Ming for generations. They had learned its rituals, its language, its ways of power. When they took the throne, they did not destroy the old. They absorbed it. They dressed in Chinese robes, performed Confucian rites, and spoke of heaven's mandate as though it had always been theirs. The empire, exhausted from rebellion and war, accepted them. The people did not rise for vengeance. They rose each morning for survival. And so, the Qing became not the strangers at the gate, but the new guardians of the Chinese dream. At first, Their rule was fragile. The land was fractured, the borders unstable. Remnants of Ming loyalists still held the south, refusing to believe the dynasty was gone. Pirates and rebels haunted the coasts. The imperial treasury was nearly empty. Yet in this uncertainty, the Qing proved both ruthless and pragmatic. They crushed opposition swiftly, but they also restored order where chaos had ruled. They reopened granaries, stabilized trade, and brought peace to provinces that had forgotten what peace felt like. Slowly, through the force of discipline and vision, they began to stitch the torn fabric of the empire back together. It was under the early emperors, Shunzi, Kangxi, and Yongjing, that the true shape of Qing civilization emerged. Kangxi, in particular, became the architect of a new age. He was born into war and chaos, but ruled with patience and intellect. He was a scholar, a general, and a statesman. He learned the Confucian classics as deeply as any Chinese-born emperor, and surrounded himself with thinkers and scientists. Under his reign, China experienced a rare harmony of tradition and curiosity. The Jesuits, those quiet Europeans who had arrived with compasses and telescopes, were welcomed into the Forbidden City. They mapped the stars, taught geometry, and painted the emperor's portrait. For a brief, shimmering moment, the Middle Kingdom and the West stood face to face, not as rivals, but as partners in wonder. The empire expanded as never before. The Qing armies, disciplined and relentless, marched beyond the Great Wall into Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang. They forged a frontier that stretched from the Pacific to the heart of Central Asia, one of the largest empires in human history. And yet, this expansion was not born of greed alone. It was a quest for security, a circle of defense drawn wide enough to protect the Chinese world from the endless steppe. The Manchus understood something the Ming had forgotten, that walls can only hold back the world for so long. Beyond them lies the infinite, and the infinite must be faced. Inside the empire, art and culture flourished again. The Qing court became a place of elegance and ritual, where scholars debated philosophy beneath painted screens, and poets captured the melancholy of time in perfect brushstrokes. Porcelain, silk, and ink once more flowed from the workshops of Jing Desen and Suzhou, delicate as breath, enduring as stone. The imperial archives grew vast, preserving not just the present, but the total memory of China. Kangxi and his successors saw themselves as caretakers of civilization, entrusted by heaven, not merely to rule, but to remember. But beneath the grace, there was always a shadow. The Qing emperors ruled as foreigners over a people who both revered and resented them. They walked a line between power and legitimacy. Every act of governance was also an act of theater, a performance to convince the empire that its soul had not been replaced. The banners and rituals of the Manchus blended with the scrolls and ceremonies of the Han. Over time, the lines blurred, and a new identity began to emerge. One neither wholly Chinese nor wholly Manchu, but something in between, a fusion that defied the old divisions. For over a century, this synthesis held. The Qing became not merely conquerors, but visionaries of stability. Under Emperor Qianlong, the empire reached its golden age, rich, powerful, and confident. The Forbidden City glittered again. The granaries were full. The markets of Canton hummed with trade. Qianlong saw himself as the master of all under heaven. He wrote poetry, commissioned art, and corresponded with monarchs of the West. China, it seemed, had rebuilt itself once again. The Middle Kingdom had returned to the center of the world. And yet, even in this triumph, the first cracks had begun to appear. Qianlong's later years were marked by extravagance, by the corruption of officials who hid behind the emperor's glory. The empire grew fat on its own certainty. The frontier wars in Burma, Vietnam, and Nepal drained resources. Peasant uprisings flared in distant provinces. The population boomed, straining the land to its limits. And far beyond the horizon, across oceans the empire had long ignored. The world was changing. The West, armed with gunpowder and industry, was awakening to global conquest. The Qing, serene in their celestial order, believed they had nothing to fear. After all, hadn't every foreign power who came before eventually bowed to China's greatness? But this time, the storm would come not from the steppes, nor from rebellion, but from the sea. The Qing had inherited the Ming's caution toward the ocean, preferring the security of the land to the uncertainty of waves. Yet, across those waters, ships were gathering, ships flying flags of Britain, France, and Portugal, carrying not tribute, but trade and ambition. The empire, so carefully rebuilt, was standing once again on the threshold of the world's edge. The same question that had haunted the Ming would now face the Qing: to open or to resist, to adapt or to endure. Still, in these twilight years of the 18th century, the world within China felt timeless. The villages thrived, temples rang with prayer, and the ancient rhythms of planting and harvest continued. The empire seemed eternal, a civilization reborn and perfected. But history, like the tide, never sleeps. Beneath the calm surface of the celestial empire, change was gathering, silent, invisible, unstoppable. As night fell over the forbidden city, the lamps of the Hall of Supreme Harmony glowed softly through the mist. The emperor sat beneath his dragon throne, surrounded by scrolls and incense, unaware that beyond the horizon, a new age was already approaching, one that would test not just China's power, but its very identity. The Ming had rebuilt China from foreign rule. The Qing had expanded it to its greatest heights. Yet now, the question that echoed through centuries returned once more. Could any dynasty, no matter how wise or mighty, hold back the weight of a changing world forever?